I need to advise you that I cover a lot of crops, and I think there is a benefit to that. So what I learn in one crop, I'll bring to another one. And raspberries are down the list from all the crops I work. So most of the information I'll show is not directly done on raspberries or blackberries, but I do believe they are applicable. And rather than going for herbicides only, I decided to expand this talk and include non-chemical approaches. So I got assistance from Lisa DeVetter from WSU. She's been doing some work, and also Ed Peachy, who used to do this work before I joined in. So I decided to start with a more, if my slides decide to show, yes, a more general overview, the first portion of this talk. So what are the principles of integrated weed management? I do believe that we're coming to a point in weed science that we must adopt integrated weed management. If we decide to go the herbicide only approach, we're just not going to have a sustainable weed control practice. When I talk about integrated weed management, it's basically a combination of multiple strategies that you have available at hand. So it could be preventive, cultural, chemical, mechanical, biological, or even more that I may not be listing here. So this picture to the right basically shows that everything should be part of your program, but prevention is basically the best way to get started. You avoid problem in the first place. And one thing I would like to add to that, and that any of those practices must be effective and also economical. You can't control weeds just by pulling by hand, but it will cost you a lot of time and money. So it's just not economical. So here are some examples for perennial crops. So preventive is basically clean farm equipment. Weed-free soil amendments, that's a big deal for caneberries, I believe, and blueberries especially. And control of the fields around your planting. Sometimes we have, I would say, Canada Tussa is a good example. Weeds that will have seeds that can be blown away with the wind. So even though you're doing a good practice in your field, next to your fence line, there's a tremendous source of weeds just blowing in. So this would be an example of preventive. Cultural would be mulches, planting time, spacing, or cover crops. Chemical, mostly herbicides. There are some organic herbicides I'll mention briefly. Mechanical is cultivator and mowing. Thermal, flaming, steaming, or electric weed control, and also biological. Biological, it's mostly for areas less disturbed. As we go into small fruits or any agricultural system, for that say, it's just not compatible. I've been working for the last 4 years in biological control, field bindweed, in organic blueberries. The problem is any sprays for spotted wing Drosophila would wipe out the biological control agent. So it's just, and after that we come and hand weed the bindweed. So we're basically not creating a conducive environment for biological control in the ag. But the challenges for perennial cropping systems are much higher than that. For instance, crop rotation. Caneberries, you still can rotate after a few years, but ideally you don't want to do it too often. When it comes to tree crops, we're talking about 50 years. It's just not possible. Tillage, we can do tillage, but we are limited to where we do tillage. So the placement and the timing are really a drawback for our in our crops. Planting time and density, again, the planting time is just one shot over many years, and the density, yes, it can help, but I would say it's mostly for other reasons, not for weed control. And then we have limitations on where we do it, as I talk about the tillage. So the problems are compounded over years. So you have a weed seed bank. If you have poor control this year, next year you have more weeds and more weeds. And in the perennial system, you cannot really reset that with a dip tillage or something like that. And then the perennial weeds problems really rise up in those systems. So even though I'm telling you to use multiple tools, there is a big dilemma in weed science, not only in weed science, but in agriculture, many ways in agriculture. The way I see agriculture, it is a biological system where we have to manage it by economical reasoning. And what I'm saying that is that we try to lower costs and increase profitability as expected. And weed control is viewed as a cost, not as an investment. The problem is we're gonna pick the most effective and cheapest tool that we have and go with it. Especially if we go for non-chemical, I very much doubt you would have enough funds to buy multiple tools to rotate over the years and the seasons. And that leads to a big problem. There's no one tool that will fix all the problems. That's true for herbicides, that's true for non-chemical weed control, even mulches. So the weed population will adapt to the weed control practices. We hear a lot about herbicide resistance, at least I do, which is basically by spraying the same herbicide over and over, we will select for plants that can tolerate that and survive. The problem is we also have weed shift. And by weed shift, I mean we're changing the composition of the species. And this picture here developed by UC Davis basically shows that we have grass and broadleaves, and in this case, they're probably spraying something that will only kill the grasses. And eventually, we're seeing more and more broadleaves. So that single herbicide will not be effective over the long run. Same could be said for tillage. If you start doing a lot of tillage, you would promote weeds like yellow nutsedge or nutsedges in general, which thrive on that environment. So that's the problem. We need to diversify, but it's very costly to diversify. So what I want you to remember is that shift happens. In that case, we will have the weeds that are more problematic down the road. And here's a good example. LOA control in caneberry. I'm picking caneberry, in this case blackberry, as a case study here. Some folks I've seen permanent grass cover in between the rows, but this here in the Willamette Valley, I'm seeing much more tilled soils. As you have tilled soils, you're going to promote the weeds that thrive on the environment, which is, this example here is bindweed. It's everywhere. It's in the rows, in between the rows. And as we go for what to do in the row planting, I would dare to say that herbicides are still the standard practice for us. Don't have data on that, but that's based on conversations. There is a new trend for caneberries on mulches. It's not taking over like we see in blueberries, but there's a lot of work on synthetic mulches, which would be like it's called weed mat, will last multiple years, or biodegradable mulches, which is Dr. DeVetter at Washington State University is basically leading the charge, as far as I know, on that front. So I'll talk a little bit about herbicides, just to start with, but not in depth, mostly because the herbicides I have available here in Oregon or Washington may not, and most likely will not be labeled in Utah or other states. It's pretty local. But this one, I know it is registered in probably 50 states, or most of the states. So where you sell from, it's called Matrix, it's one of the trade names, and there's probably other trade names that you can find. And there is a supplemental label that's renewed every year, specifically for small fruits, for blueberries and caneberries, and probably other crops as well. Why would you use Matrix? If you have a problem like quackgrass, if you have a mallow or cheeseweed, it will suppress it, but it's a good help. Groundsel and dandelion. I do believe that quackgrass will be the driver for you to select this herbicide. So what's quackgrass? One of the best ways to identify it is if you look in the stem, you're gonna see this clasping auricle around the stem. And then if you do find it, dig around the soil, you might see stolons. Chances are you have quackgrass. What can you do for quackgrass? Green sulfuron at 2 to 4 ounces per acre would be, this is Matrix. When I'm saying 2 to 4 ounces is of the product. And you can use it up to 21 days before harvest. You should be using with adjuvant, NIS, or crop oil. And the max rate per acre in a year is 4 ounces. However, if you're bending your field, you could do 2 applications if you're spraying only 50% of your field. The crop age will depend on the species. So for raspberry, you must wait 1 growing season before you use it for the first time. If it's older, it's fine. And blackberries are a bit more sensitive, so 2 growing seasons. really important, there was a recent change, that's why I picked matrix. Do not go over the top, especially when the new primocans are about to emerge. It's gonna look ugly. So timing and placements are key for Resulfron. That's probably true for almost anything in agriculture, right? Irrigation, fertilizers, but in this case, what I'm referring to is the type of injury that you can promote on your new primocans. And this picture on the right is not looking as bad as it can look, but it gives you an idea what kind of mild symptom Resulfron can promote in your plant. How do you avoid that? Apply before primocan emergency. So whenever you are expecting, I would say give it yourself at least 2 weeks prior to when you expect this primocan to start happening. Sometimes you don't see it, but it's just about to start popping up, and that the primocans will be very sensitive. The second approach would be after the primocan are 3 foot long, you can spray, but you must target the lower 1 foot of those cans. You really want to protect the growing points. If you damage the growing points with the herbicides, that's going to be a recipe for disasters in the following year, especially. How you make your application is also important. Most of you are probably using a regular flat fan nozzle, which is good for efficacy. It gives you all sizes of droplets, but it has a big problem. It does not prevent drift. It will give you fine droplets and all the way to large droplets, but the fine droplets can travel a long distance, multiple feet away, depending on the wind. And the very first thing next to your nozzle is your own crop. Most growers talk to me about drift as something that your neighbor would do to yourself, but there is this type of self-inflicted damage that your nozzle can do to your crop, and you may not be seeing. One of the best ways to minimize it is using these drift reduction nozzles. I like the off-center for perennial crops because it gives you a band depending on the height of your nozzle. So you can get a 3 foot band when you're about 1.5 foot above the ground, something in those lines that may be lost on the units here, so don't quote me on that. But you can use from TJET, it's called AIUB, which is air induction underleaf bending nozzle, which is the red one on the top here, or Air Mix OC from Agro Gold. Either one would be fine. The only exception is the Air Mix from Agro Gold is drift reduction at lower pressure. So you must work below 50 PSI, ideally between 20 and 30 if you're going for that kind of nozzle. And you should always target the lower part of the plant, as I was discussing in the previous slide. And that's a good picture where your application should be placed, and ideally you wouldn't have damage on the open leaves. Another herbicide that might be coming down in most of the states, I'm not sure about that yet because we are waiting on EPA to approve it, is Stinger or clopyralid. And that's going to be only that trade name because it's coming through IR4 to help us get this product. This work was started many years ago, I think 2004 when I saw the first data set. So what is that? It's another auxine herbicide, just like 2,4-D, but it's really, really effective against Canada thistle, which is, in our case here, in raspberries and blackberries, probably the #1 weed growers complain. I would not discuss rates or timing just yet. I just want to point out that label, if the manufacturer listens to my request, they will include a sponge wiper application. And this is a sponge wiper application that can be retrofitted to your existing backpack. And the benefit to that is that you can cover much more ground with using less product. It's as effective as the broadcast, but there's no drift. There's no or minimal ground contamination because you're using a lot less product, and you will save money. I've done some studies in hops. That's hence this picture here, and it was less, about 50% lower cost compared to a broadcast application. So just to keep in mind. Now is the part that I believe that will be more applicable across all the audience here, which is the use of synthetic mulches. So as I talk about synthetic mulches, basically there are two types. The first one are the traditional plastic mulches, which should last multiple seasons. And this picture on the right is in a blueberry field here in Oregon. You can see it's called weed mat, commonly referred as weed mat. I believe there are many manufacturers. And this type of material is a polyethylene woven geotextile mulch that will allow the water to go through, but serve as a physical barrier for the weeds. Works pretty well, and the problem is supposed to last multiple years to basically dilute that upfront cost, but you can damage after 5 or 6 years. You start damaging it from your weed management approach. A second mulch that's now, I believe, well developed as well is the biodegradable mulches. There are a few companies that they're selling that I have never worked with those, but that's the time I approached DeVetter up in Washington. Dr. DeVetter said that there were good results in raspberry. There are 3 or 4 publications out showing that it really promote the establishment of new plants in raspberries. It suppressed the weeds, but they were seeing a promotion in nematode lesion. And to best of my knowledge, the nematode was basically a result of warmer soil temperatures. As you warm up the soil early in the season, you're basically accelerating some processes like the egg hatching of nematodes. So they saw more nematodes. So perhaps you should do a better work on this fumigation pre-plant if you're using mulches. And I suppose that's true for both mulches because you're probably warming the soil both ways. What are the limitations of that? The most notable one is the high cost up front. So the wheat mat, which is the one on the picture here, would cost you about $5,000 an acre with materials and installation and labor. But it should last 5 years, up to 10 years perhaps, so you're diluting that. Very expensive because after a few years you need to open up that so you can supply your soil amendments. So it's pretty labor intensive. And it has limitations as well. As I told you before, the weeds will adapt to whatever strategy that you have. And in our case, it's bindweed. Bindweed or any vine weeds will grow on the sides of the mulch and then climb on the plants or through the planting holes that you may have. Specifically for blueberries, I think we have a larger planting hole than what I saw in the pictures from raspberries. So maybe this problem is bigger on blueberries. And now that you have a pretty expensive plastic mulch in your field, you really don't want to damage. So it limits the options you have for weed control. You can't do cultivation as easily as you could on the sides, provided if you can keep it away, that's fine. Even mowing, depending on the type of mower you have, if it gets into the plastic, would damage severely. So flaming is out of question. And if you're organic, you're really out of options. So I've been evaluating new tools for weed control, and that's mostly done in blueberries, but I believe this equipment has good applications in caneberries as well. The first one is saturated steam. So saturated steam is basically a fancy way to say hot water. I have a slide about it in a second, but you wouldn't see as much steam going up from the field, mostly hot water. I also try a brush weeder, which is this picture here to your left. It's a spinning shaft that will basically cut the weeds at the soil surface. And I look into organic herbicides, either as a broadcast application or using the wiper, just like I described for the Stinger future label. So what is the saturated steam? So it's a machine. There are several sizes. The one I have is the smallest one for ag use, which is probably the one that would be applicable for small farms. And it is the steam is generated by a diesel burner. And then it's under pressure here in this cylinder. Forgot the pressure precisely here, but because it is under pressure, you can heat up that water to above boiling temperature, but will not boil. And that's the saturated steam. Because you're doing that, you're not losing energy by creating vapor, and then the vapor is lost because you're not trapping heat as well as hot water. And the second problem of the steam is that the rate of heat transfer from steam is not as effective as hot water. So most of this would come out as hot water. you can see a little bit of steam in the picture here where we were applying to the edges of the mulches. This unit uses a gas pump to bring water from your tank reservoir. There are some that may use the PTO from your tractor to pump that water. The temperature in the nozzle, as we measure, not the best way, but with the tools I had in hand, we reach out 190 Fahrenheit. This is really fast acting. As you're driving down the field, you look back, you will see wilting weeds in a matter of minutes, just like these pictures. This is probably dandelions, or it was. How fast can you go? With an applicator like this, that will cover 20 inches, we managed to go a mile an hour, and it was giving us 730 gallons to the acre if we were doing the entire acre. But in this case, we were just doing this 20 inches on each side of the mulch, so it's about a third of a blueberry field. What's one problem that we notice? It's a continuous flow. So once you turn it up, we'll get up to the temperature in about 2 minutes, but you gotta be moving, otherwise you're burning diesel and throwing away water. Here's the brush weeder. The unit we got, it's mounted on a tractor. This is originally developed for vineyards, where they use for removing suckers and cutting some of the weeds. So we figured that perhaps we could use next to the mulch as well. The spinning shaft, depending on the RPM of your tractor, would be about 1100 RPM on the shaft itself. It requires a hydraulic output of 6.5 to 8 gallons a minute if you're going one side or two side. So that means you must have a tractor of at least 40 horsepower. I've tried with smaller ones using the hydraulic power pack that relies on the PTO. It's just not as good. You can get up to speed, but will not have enough torque to sustain this rotation when the weeds get bigger. So it's okay, I would not recommend. So here's jumping straight to the results that we got 8 weeks later. The way we've done it, we lay out all these 5 treatments, which is steam, the brush weeder, the first herbicide is X, second herbicide is suppress, and then non-treated. And then each plot was split into 5, and then we did all possible combinations. So we would have, in reality, 25 treatments. Every time I try to present a table with 25, a figure with 25 bars, it's just way too confusing. So I'm combining everything and showing what happens 8 weeks later at the end of 2 applications. So here we had steam on average, giving us 50% control, brush weeder, not much different than the organic herbicides, and this is non-treated, that some of these plots were treated previously. You can see here that the organic herbicides were not great. Brush weed was okay, but steam was the best in the spring. But remember that for us, springtime, fall and winter as well, it's continuous rainfall. So steam worked on the weeds that were present, but probably the day after, there was a new emergence. As we switch over to the summer season here, when rain basically stops for us, or mostly stops, not as bad as California, you can see the efficacy of steam just jumped to 90%. It was just a fantastic work. This is at 1 mile an hour. The brush weeder as well, much higher efficacy compared to the spring. The herbicides improved a little bit, but and here's the non-treated with the combinations before. So brush and steam were really effective in these studies, and this is out of 3 field studies over 2 years. So really, to separate the treatments, we should be looking at the cost. The steamer, there's a lot of math that goes to get to this number here, but just to give you an idea, that unit that I showed you would cost $10,000. If you buy with the trailer and applicators and now the complete unit, I end up paying $15,000. Based on that cost, assuming it would last 10 years and maintenance of 15% of the total value every year, or actually 5%, I'm sorry, we got to $51,000 depending on how many acres, $51 per acre depending on how many acres you use, with the assumption you apply it 3 times a season. Brush weeder was much cheaper. The unit will range from as low as $5,000 to $15,000 depending if you need a frame, if you're buying one side or 2 sides and all that. So $32, assuming you're driving at the same speed of the steamer. I've done some follow-up work, and I can say that you can go up to 2.5 miles without loss in weed efficacy, which would significantly drive lower your cost here. Axe and suppress at the highest rate per label would cost you $160 to $126 for the efficacy that in our case it wasn't good. So hand hoeing here, just as an estimate, 6 hours an acre would cost you $90. So both steamer and the brush weeder were cheaper than hand hoeing. And organic herbicides for us are not effective because we don't have constant sunlight in the spring, so there's a lot of escapes. Weed control in planting holes. The saturated steam can also be applied targeted with this type of applicator, either an open shower, as you can see on the picture, or with smaller hoods just to go where the weeds are growing. And we compare that to weed slayer, suppress, and axe, which were the 3 organic herbicides we had at the time, either apply as a broadcast or with a sponge wiper, just the herbicides, not the steam. Here's a picture to your right. You can see what I was trying to control is the bindweed growing from the base next to the new shoots. And this could be a similar case for raspberries. You have tissue or any weeds growing between your shoots. And in the case of blueberries, these new shoots are really important because eventually the older shoots will be cut down to allow for the new growth to bear fruits. So damaging these would compromise yield later on. And the bindweed will climb and basically take over the canopy. So what I have on my figure here is bindweed control as percent visual estimates, non-treated, hand weeding. This is how the commercial farmers are doing. Steam, caprylic acid, this is suppressed, broadcast, or with a wiper. Eugenol is the active ingredient on weed slayer, either broadcast or with a wiper. And ammonium nanoate is the active ingredient on axe, broadcast, or wiper. And percent control, you can see that the best treatment was steam, not much different than hand weeding. A lot faster to do the steaming than the hand weeding. Why I don't have 100% control? Because there's a lot of regrowth. We're just applying steam or cooling the weeds from the top. You can't really reach the root system, so they just keep coming back. Most of the organic herbicides were not effective. The exception would be eugenol, weed slayer. How about crop safety? This is a second study that I've done over 2 years, looking at 2 varieties, Duke and Alia. And what we've done, because we measure the new shoots, because that's the most sensitive part for steam and the most sensitive part for the herbicide. And what I'm showing here is how much that new shoot grew in caliper over 2 seasons. So we measure at the beginning, we measured the end of 2019, and also in 2020. So it's just growth. You can see the non-treated here. This is our benchmark. And here's the steam applied at 1, 2, or 4 times. And this 4x basically means 4-fold the amount of steam needed to kill the weeds. And we are not really damaging the Duke new shoots. For the Elliots, we see a little bit of reduction in growth at the highest steam rate. And the way I've done it is just going slower to make sure that we deliver more steam, we warm up even further that tissue and cause damage as we see here. Looking at the organic herbicides, you can see these high rates will severely damage some of these shoots. And then the ammonium nanoate broadcast was really a no-go. We're really damaging the blueberries and also in a wiper. What kind of injury we saw in this case? Here's an example of the injury. So the steam at the highest rate, we saw some reduction. You can see here, I basically put my applicator sideways and drenched these lower 1 foot or 20 inches of the shoot. And we saw leaf burning, not severe damage to the canes. They continue to the shoots, they continue to grow. And it was a transient damage. We burned the leaves, but they continue. Here's the axe with a wiper. You can see here we lost, in some cases we lost quite a few shoots, and we tagged the shoots so we knew which shoot we started the treatment back in 2019. And it was really damaging to the crop. And weed slayer, which was a new herbicide back at that time, was showing some interesting injury here, some chlorosis, yellowing, narrow leaves, and was moving up and down. We saw even damaging other parts of the plant. So recently we learned that Agro Gold is one of the adjuvants that goes into weeds layer. Was basically contaminated with glyphosate and other herbicides. So I basically stopped working with that herbicide for now. It's prohibited for sale in California, Oregon, and Washington. That was last time I checked. I suppose this is continuing out elsewhere, just so you know. So the weed management in organic system using blueberry as an example, what are the outcomes? The picture to your right shows what steam can do at the half a mile rate. It's really good control, and that's about 4 to 6 weeks after we apply steam. With the cost below $50, I would say saturated steam and the brush weeder were the most effective options and cost effective for that matter. If you compare it for the herbicides were as high as 150, it's really a no-brainer that we should not use organic herbicides here in the Willamette Valley. But there are limitations. First limitation I saw is water consumption. We're talking about 730 gallons per acre. We're borderline to irrigation at that point, right? So we were applying a much smaller area. So a third of the field, so a third of that is 200 and something gallons per acre. Much better, but still we have a bottleneck on the operational capacity. Our tank was about 100-gallon storage. One could use a larger tank, but as you go for a larger tank, you're carrying more weight. So perhaps you could be creating soil compaction if you go on that approach. But definitely more than 100 gallons would be the way to go. The biggest problem I noticed was equipment maintenance. And this thing is assembled, it's actually designed and developed in Australia, but now it's assembled here in Fresno, California, which is possible for me to drive down there and fix it, which I had to do in the spring, basically damaging the boiler, and we had to replace it. But if you're far away, like Utah, a little drive mid-spring from Utah to California in the middle of a pandemic is not as feasible, I would say. So we need technical maintenance nearby, and that, I suppose this is a limitation for every new technology. For the brush weeder, dust was the biggest problem. This equipment is commonly available in vineyards, at least here and also in California. So maintenance and technical expertise is not in shortage by any means, but the dust was a big deal. In the summer months, we really had to keep our plots a bit smaller because we were generating so much dust that before harvest, it wasn't a good idea. We also saw that we damaged the weed mat. If there is an existing hole that you could see before using this brush weeder, you would just make it bigger. And that's a big deal because you're potentially reducing the longevity of that weed mat. And it's really incompatible with other types of mulches that are not synthetic, like sawdust, which is also commonly used here. We just spread all over the place. So is saturated steam a viable alternative for weed control? I would say sometimes. It is effective in controlling weeds, and it has shown crop safety. I didn't discuss it, but I believe blackberries and raspberries would be much more tolerant to steam compared to blueberries, just by the look of it. I tried to kill Himalayan blackberries here, which is similar species. That's a tough weed to control. Its steam wasn't really effective. So I think there is a good potential to be used in that system. So crop safety, yes, and compatible with mulches because we're basically doing no-till, no chemical weed control. The economics, well, lower costs when you use targeted application. And I really like this idea of using the handheld to target perennial weeds because they are patchy in nature. But it's only viable, I would say, if you have a premium for your crop because you're probably selling it as organic or some sort of labeling. It's really hard to compete on the economics against herbicides. You can cover a lot more ground and have long-term weed control with great margins. The environment is definitely a bonus. We have lower product use because we are just using water, no soil tillage, and no residues. So for small farms, I think this has potential. For large ones, maybe we need something else. And there's a second problem that we didn't really discuss. It's the energy requirement for weed control. This is a paper that came out in 2019 that basically done some calculations with assumptions. How much energy would it take to control weeds in 1 acre? As you can see here, right at the center, the green bar are the herbicides as a generic, all herbicides put together. But you can see to the right is a lot of the technology we were trying are much more higher, much more energy demanding than herbicides or tillage. For instance, plastic and mulches, where basically steam is right here, and plastic mulches is by far the most energy consumption. So assuming that we're using fossil fuels to produce these materials, and in my case I was with diesel, are we really doing the best thing by using mulches? And I don't know the answer, but it's something I take into consideration. So I've been looking to other ways to control weeds, and now just starting this year, we are looking to weed control. Of course, first into blueberries and hazelnuts, but eventually I want to get down to caneberries. Uh, we are behind because of the pandemic. The equipment arrived in Thanksgiving, but nobody can travel into the U.S. from the manufacturer because of the pandemic. So we decided to assemble it this past month, and I think we make it work. That was our first try last week. You can see the picture here. So the way it works, it generates high voltage up to 12,000 volts in here that are applied by these metal fingers here, and it will heat up the weeds. That's why you're seeing the steam here. You're heating up the weeds and they will wilt. So it's a thermal approach, but unlike the steam, I'm heating the weeds directly. So the current goes through the plant and will produce heat that will basically rupture the cells and wilt. And the steam, we're heating the water that will transfer the energy. I would like to acknowledge the funding, and was more an overview than any specifics for raspberry. I'll stop sharing right now.
Thank you, Dr. Moretti. We've got a few questions that have come in. I'm going to try and combine a few of them so we can get through more of them. Just to remind you all that we're going to be having about a 10-15 minute break here. We'll start at 10:20 again with our next speaker. So we've got some time here to answer some questions, or if you need to take a break, that's great too. So a couple of the questions here are kind of on the same theme, and that is, what about using animals for weed control, whether it be sheep or goats or wheat or geese or turkey or chickens in cane fruit, in raspberries or blackberries?
I have not seen in cane fruit. I've seen some folks trying hops and definitely trying vineyards. Vineyards is common. First thing you need to keep in mind is that you need the availability of the animals in your area to do that. You know, if you're using sheep, there needs to be enough sheep in your surrounds to graze your field, which happens fairly commonly here in Oregon. We use sheep for grazing grass-seed fields, so it could be an option. I don't know if they would damage the caneberries. Those animals have preference, and if they like raspberries, they would probably be chewing on it much more so than the other species. So it's one consideration, but it could be done, especially in small scale.
Yeah, one of the thoughts I had was, with at least for the larger scale growers that are doing fresh market and GAP certification, then you've got to keep pretty much all the animals out of there as possible. So that's another component, but maybe for small acreage. One comment was about, or question was about biodegradable mulches. Do they actually chemically break down, or are they just breaking down into small plastic particles that are going to stay in the environment?
So for that, I will refer you to that website that I listed from Small Fruits in Washington State. I don't know enough, but I was reading, I got interested about that as well. Ideally, you would till that plastic into the ground with a rototiller, and then the small pieces would be further degraded by microbes. And there are specific enzymes that would go after that, break into smaller compounds, and then would be degraded. What Dr. DeVitter was saying is that they were finding pieces of plastic still there, and that degradation was not happening in Washington.
Yeah, I saw her presentation. That was interesting. That, like you said, they're claiming that there's microbial breakdown, but if they buried the pieces very deep, then it didn't happen like it was supposed to. They had to be near the surface, from what I gather. But yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for that insight. One person was asking here about convolvulus or bindweed and what kinds of approaches might be best, whether it's wiping or organic byproducts or mulching, or what do you, and particularly for smaller acreage, what are some of your options for bindweed? We have a lot of bindweed here, as I think everybody does.
Now you're not using the herbicide. So the systemic herbicide will be my first option to really hammer it. So you slow down growth. The second option is, if you can, assuming it's very small, go after the patches and pull it up. So you would suppress further growth. They will come back, but then I would use some mulches on top and go with the wiper or spot spraying, whatever comes up. If you are organic, you would use organic herbicides. They're just like mowing. They're not gonna go down to the roots and kill it. But to be honest, even with herbicides, we still have a challenge. It's just keep on coming. Is that you can survive with it. I gave up on eradicating it. I don't think it's possible.
So what chemical herbicides are most effective against bindweed?
Quinclorax number one. We have a label for it in blueberries, raspberries in Washington and Oregon. For some reason, it's not labeled in Utah.
I didn't realize that. So there is a special local need for Washington and Oregon.
Yes.
Okay, well that's good to know. And we I may be visiting with you more because we've worked with the Utah Department of Ag, and if there's people out there that are needing bindweed control in raspberries or blackberries, we can work with them to get if there's a special local need for another state where there's a raspberry industry. They've been really good to work with us on expanding that usage. So that's really good to know, because we've definitely had problems, and quinclorac I think is a great option.
Yes.
If we can get it. So that's a great thing to know.
The only concern for quinclorac is if you are in sandy soils, like some places in California, you could leach down to the groundwater.
Yeah.
I have never been to Utah, so I don't know what to expect from there.
Yeah, we don't have groundwater. We don't have any water.
We don't have groundwater.
So
Okay.
that's a good caution. One thing maybe too, and I'm assuming you're involved with the Pacific Northwest Weed Management Guide.
Yes, I am.
That's a fantastic resource. Maybe you can tell people how to get to that to access it.
So the best way would be, and I'll share my screen once again. Can you see it?
Yes.
So if you type PNW Weed Handbook, it should take you here, Weed Management Handbook. In here, you go under Weed, Horticulture Crop, Small Fruit, and you can go for specific sections, or you can just download the whole area here. So blackberry, raspberry, that's me. Be careful, because what I do is I look what's labeled in Washington, in Oregon. I never look into Utah. So you've got to be careful with what I say here. Paper accepts everything. And
Yeah,
then you come down here to other crops, kiwi fruit. And here's blueberry, which is the one I've been working the most. What I like about this approach here is that I give you the AI, the active ingredient rate, maximum season rate, how often you can reapply, the minimal age, replant interval, and pre-harvest interval. This is not going to replace the label, but once you read the label, you're familiar, you just want to double check some numbers. This is really like a go-to quick way to evaluate.
And you've got those breaking down by crop stage as well, right? Where you can look at.
Well, the crop stage information would be down here. New plants, site preparation. It's just a table, you cannot do everything. And here is quinclorac here that we have for blueberries and caneberries.
Great.
So just a reminder, this is what's legal in Oregon and Washington. You need to double check and do your homework for Utah.
Okay, thank you. A couple more questions I had here. What's the frequency of passes that you need to make with the steam and the brush weeders?
So the steam, in the springtime, I saw good control for about 3 weeks. By the 4th week, I would definitely reapply before the weeds get too big. I didn't discuss it, but smaller weeds are easier to kill, and that's probably true with any method. So with smaller weeds, I really think I could go even a bit faster than what I was doing, 1.5 miles perhaps. So that would reduce the cost. As you go into summertime, and for us, it does not rain. If you do a good work, there was no need to come back 4 weeks later, maybe 8 weeks later, but it depends on the year. Sometimes July 4th, in one of the years, it was 60 degrees a year and we got 2 inches of rain. So that goes back to the spring for us, and then their weeds will just popping up. So if the weeds are not growing because there's no moisture, maybe 8 weeks would last. Not because it has any soil activity, it's just because there's no new growth.
Yeah. So I would just add a comment on your brush. I'm not familiar with either of those technologies, so I found that really interesting. Your one caution about the dust, I don't know if you have problems with mite outbreaks, but we see a lot in the midsummer. We see a lot of spider mites and things on the lower foliage in raspberries. And I think from talking to our entomologists that that's made worse when you kick up a lot of dust. So that might be a concern that our growers may want to be worried about a little bit if they're going to try the brush weeder, is the potential for mite flare-ups.
So before you go for the brush weeder, I wasn't too satisfied with the brush weeder.
Okay.
It's not as effective for weed control. I would say buy a regular mower that can go in and out of your row and just suppress the weeds. The brush weeder will do the same thing as that, but you don't have the dust. Or if you do, it's much less dust.
Okay.
Mowing will not kill the weeds, but perhaps you can suppress seed production and definitely reduce photosynthetic area and therefore root growth for the perennial ones. It keeps things under control.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got a couple more minutes if there's a few more questions that come in, but I'm going to pause asking questions for just a minute here and point out I mentioned, or during Alyssa's presentation, she mentioned about doing the fruit pricing survey, and we're going to post the link for that survey here in just a minute.